Tony, if I can come to yourself, one of the charges often levelled at the Stop the War coalition is it's all very well saying you don't want the war to start and you want the war to end once it has started. But surely there'll be a bloodbath if the troops were just withdrawn immediately.
Well, there would have to be some negotiated settlement with somebody, and that would involve negotiation with Karzai or whoever succeeds him if there's a change as a result of the next round of elections there. There would have to be some sort of settlement. What
sort of settlement? What kind of political solution could there be? Surely this is a huge mess now. We're seeing more and more attacks. In fact, the violence is increasing, not decreasing, and the troops are not always part of that violence. It is inter-tribal violence. There are groups themselves in the region which are conducting attacks against their own people. That's what many would claim.
Don't be too pessimistic about it. I mean, nobody really likes a war. Afghans don't like being killed. British troops don't like being sent to kill them or being killed themselves or injured. So, I mean, I think there's a background that would be favourable to a settlement, and it'll be presented in such a way as to make it look like a success for everybody, because that's the way that governments behave. But I think that is what will happen. When, I can't tell you, but I think it will happen. There are different aspects we haven't talked about. One, of course, is the fact that Pakistan is a nuclear weapons state. It has nuclear weapons. And one of the factors in America that has worried Washington for some time has been the fact that some extremist group might get control of Pakistan's nuclear weapons and become a threat. And that is a factor that will have to be dealt with. And Pakistan now is, in that sense, in a strong position to negotiate for the best arrangements for itself. But no, I'm not a pessimist. I think you have to look forward to the possibility of a settlement. One minor factor that hasn't been discussed is General Dunnett, a former commander of the British Army, has decided to work with the Conservative Party as an advisor, which means that in the general election in Britain next summer, there will be a choice between the Conservatives who favour more troops and the British government, which is much more cautious. Now, whether this will become a factor in the election campaign, I don't know. But it's one that will be identified and thought about, and I think it's very unlikely that the British people would want to vote for a government that wanted to send more troops to Afghanistan for all the reasons that Chris and others have mentioned.
Well, of course, the argument for more troops will be presented as this will make the war shorter. We'll have that final playoff, as it were, and this will make the troops able to come home quicker. What would be your answer to that, and what's the alternative? If troops were to withdraw, in your opinion, how do you combat the argument that this would actually make the situation worse, not better?
Yeah, well, it is a mad argument that, you know, we need to draw down, we need to reduce our engagement, and we do that by sending more troops. And it's exactly the logic that brought the US into more and more into throwing more and more troops and more bombers at Vietnam at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 1970s. I mean, this argument that if we withdraw the troops, then you know, there'll be a bloodbath is a kind of familiar one. It's the last justification for every imperial war. When the war's gone terribly wrong, as they all do, then it's the final thing that the colonialist says. We need to stay there in order to ensure that these benighted people who can't sort their own country out and can't live side by side don't tear each other apart. The truth is, the occupation itself has been a catastrophe. I mean, there is a bloodbath in Afghanistan going on at the moment, and it's going on under our watch. And the level of violence is not going down, it's going up. Of the 222 British soldiers who died in Afghanistan, all but 7 of them have died since 2006. Now that tells you, and of course the peak of killings was actually this summer, so that tells you that we're not bringing down, we're not stopping violence, we're not curtailing the violence, we are generating the violence as well as actually delivering the violence ourselves. And so I don't think the argument stacks up. And it does depend on some notion that, you know, the Afghan people can't move forward themselves. Now, obviously, things would be hard, but there have been periods in the history of Afghanistan in the last 150 years where there have been moves towards a serious democratic organisation. The question you have to ask yourselves is military intervention the solution or is it the problem? And Afghanistan has a long history of being occupied by its neighbours. Particularly the last 30 years have been one of almost constant intervention by foreign powers. It hasn't worked. It's created a disaster for those people. As a Democrat, I believe that the Afghan people should be allowed to decide their own future.
Well, talking about democracy, you have an elected government in Pakistan, one of Afghanistan's neighbours. It too now is more and more drawn into the war on terror. You mentioned hundreds of British soldiers have lost their lives, well, thousands of Pakistani soldiers have been killed in this war. What's your opinion about how Pakistan is now being impacted upon, especially considering we've got a huge British Pakistani population here as well?
Well, this is obviously an absolutely crucial question, as Tony says. Partly because Pakistan is a nuclear power. I mean, I think again the kind of the echoes of the arguments used at the time of the Vietnam War are very interesting. I mean, what is essentially being said by the NATO forces, NATO governments, is they've obviously getting nowhere in Afghanistan, so they're starting to say, look, the problem in Afghanistan actually comes from Pakistan.
Yeah, they're getting the support from there.
Yeah.
There's a danger now that nuclear weapons might be hijacked by extremists.
Yeah. Just as Johnson and Nixon said, you know, they couldn't deal with Vietnam, so suddenly the problem comes from Cambodia. Mm-hmm. Now, I think the opposite is the case, essentially. I mean, without simplifying the problem too much, the problems in Pakistan are actually created by the US and the NATO intervention in Afghanistan, or at least exacerbated massively. You know, where does the militancy, the radicalisation in the western parts of Pakistan come from? It comes from a sense of bitterness and anger about what the US essentially is doing, partly in Afghanistan and partly the extent to which the US is manipulating, pressurising and dominating the Pakistani government. So, you know, obviously it's a complex situation, there's lots of aspects to it, but I think, again, if the US wasn't intervening in the region, I think the problems that are being generated in Pakistan wouldn't be nearly so great, and therefore I think a military solution, again, is the wrong one.
Okay. We are drawing to a close soon, so Tony, I'd like to ask you what keeps you going, and for viewers at home who might want to help in the campaigning against the war, what do your advice to them be?
Well, I get lots of letters saying, how can I help? And I would say, join in the local campaign, because your work is necessary and your financial contributions are helpful. And also, because you will then find you've got a lot of good people working alongside you and making progress. But I suppose it's the same throughout history. At every period in history, there is a battle to be fought for justice, and there is no final end, there's no final defeat, and there's no final victory, and all you have to do is to go on in every generation, taking up the right cause and fighting for it and speaking for it and hoping that it'll make an impact. And on that basis, I think you could look back over history and find exactly the same justification explains some of the great successes we've had. The independence of India, for example, of South Africa, the end of apartheid, the votes for women. These things came out of people prepared to put the effort in. And if you believe in something, put the effort in, and you'll make some progress. It's a very modest claim, but still I think it's probably the most useful thing that I can say as an old man who's been at it a long time, and am still as determined to put across my view as I was when I was younger.
Well, Tony, many people find you inspiring for the stances that you've taken, and certainly for your persistence in doing so. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Chris Nineham. Thank you also to Andrew Burgin and to Murtaza Ali Shah. You've been watching Islam Channel, the Politics and Media show, where we've discussed should British troops be leaving Afghanistan. Do join us for next edition of the show. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.